Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. Another heavyweight news mashup video today. I'll be looking to do a few more of these in the next couple of weeks. Heavy work schedule at the moment, and I'm still trying to do one video a day at least, so at least I can cram in 4 or 5 different things into this video, some commentary along the way. Expect to see a few more of these, but we'll crack into it, so buckle in. Let's go. So starting with Tyson Fury's next fight date, it looks like it's firming up as October 5th. Bob Arum saying we're looking at October 5, the Garden in New York. I think the Garden is trying to clear out a concert and so forth. They are optimistic we can open it up October 5th. Having had Fury conquer Vegas, show he's the equivalent to Elvis and the other great acts that have hit this town, I think we have to take him to the East and roll him out, so to speak, on the big stage at Madison Square Garden. And I think this is part of the strategy. It really is the sort of sales tour, these couple of interim fights that they're having before a mega rematch with Deontay Wilder. They've had him on the West Coast in Vegas, now take him to the East Coast. It's all about selling him to the casual market. The guys that are on the sort of fringe of the sport that sort of dip in, dip out, but potentially will look to buy a pay-per-view for a big fight. I'm sure you know people that are like that as well, that only come in for a couple of fights a year in boxing or UFC, that they hear the buzz generated, they're sports fans, they sort of get captured by it, and they'll watch those big cards. Certainly, I know a lot of people like that. I'm sure you do too. And this is part of it now. It's about selling him, and off the back of that performance against Tom Schwartz, they're off to a good start. Wasn't the fight we wanted to see, and let's hope the next one is better. And sort of getting onto that now, because Darrell Miller, his name is constantly sort of being linked to Tyson Fury since that weekend fight against Tom Schwartz, and his promoter Dimitri Salita is still fanning the flames there, and he's also co-promoted by Greg Cohen, who's been making public statements. Miller himself was, ringside for that fight. He was doing interviews galore. He's really trying to sort of rehabilitate his image and get back into a big fight sooner rather than later. His suspension, as it were, of out of the rankings for the WBA is up in September. So could he fight October 5th? It's a possibility, but that's still pretty fresh, and Eddie Hearn is saying a few things about that. We'll get to that in a second, but Miller's promoter, Dimitri Salita, is saying it would be a fantastic fight, an exciting promotion. I think at some point in the future, it is realistic that it can be a mega event. It is great to see so much fan interest in this fight. The focus is on taking the right steps to move forward in a positive way. We are working and exploring all possibilities on getting Darrell back in the ring. And Miller, he's also said, my suspension is up in September, and I think October would be a great date. If I got the shout, I'd take it straight away. I've had conversations with Bob Arum already. And I think at this point, for a lot of fans, do we want to see Miller back, in a big fight so soon after what happened? I think for some people, they won't care. Let's face it. For casual fans, they won't really be aware of this sort of situation. It's the people that are a bit more sort of stern on the sort of performance-enhancing drug side that are going to be sort of, look, you're stepping into a fight 6 months after you failed 3 doping tests and you're getting paid millions of dollars. It's not a very good signal. Not at all. But Miller, is he a possibility? I think, he is, but I don't think that's going to be the fight. I honestly don't think that we end up being the fight. I think some of what's happening now is about Darrell Miller using Tyson Fury's name to actually build some profile and keep him in people's minds, get some headlines, build some buzz for him again, because obviously he's just come off the worst sort of portion of media attention in his whole career. So we shall see where that goes, but Eddie Hearn, he's talked about being disgusted with the talk of Fury and Miller, saying, the dust hasn't settled though, has it? So he said this to IFL TV. I'm not bothered about Darrell Miller, but the dust hasn't settled. How can you say the dust has settled? People ask me if I would work with Darrell Miller again. In 2-3 years, who knows what could happen? Right now, how can you work with Darrell Miller? We're talking about something that happened 6 or 8 weeks ago. That's everything that's wrong with boxing. If you don't make an example of people like this wasn't just one little substance. This is all-out blatant cheating. I've said I like Darrell Miller, but we don't make an example of this. Why do we even bother? What's the point in testing? Why don't we just say, yeah, take what you want? There are so many hypocrites in the sport, and in the past I've had guys box in my shows that might be a year and a half, 2 years after a failed test, and they've been fighting again. But in this case, it's 8 weeks since, and it's still extremely raw and personal to me. And I think a lot of people will agree with that sentiment. I mean, boxing is one of those sports that does, have a short memory. A couple of years, 2 or 3 years, it all will be forgotten by a lot of fans, and the sort of churn of boxing fans and casual boxing fans in particular, that'll just be a blip on the radar that's way in the rear view in a couple of years. But right now, if that was to be announced, say for October, and it was Miller announced in a couple of weeks or a month, I think there would be a bit of outcry from boxing fans. Maybe casual fans wouldn't care so much. It doesn't seem to me like it's a viable option, but it's boxing, Stranger things have happened, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised if it was Miller. But in terms of Eddie Hearn, he's also told IFL TV that the date for Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz's rematch looks set to be between November 16 and December 14. And Anthony Joshua, according to Hearn, is still thinking New York might be the place to do it. So he says himself, though, this is Hearn, a sensible man would say do it in the UK. But he says Anthony feels as though it would be special to rewrite history and get the win in Madison Square Garden. It's really not about the money so much, it's just about where we believe this fight should take place, and those decisions will be made in the next week. Moving on, though, and this is one that I wanted to get to before it starts getting a bit of moss on it. Sort of came out a couple of days ago, but I've been busy, as I mentioned. Mauricio Suleiman sort of clapping back at Dillian Whyte and Eddie Hearn over the whole situation with this WBC mandatory. He's not a happy chappy. So he's made some comments to Seconds Out. I've spoken at length with Eddie Hearn and Dillian Whyte's group, but unfortunately they have turned this into a media circus, which is highly regrettable because that influences the process. We have the highest respect for Dillian. He's our number one contender, our silver champion, my friend and a tremendous fighter. But to be insulted over and over again makes it very difficult to continue addressing a situation. We are going through a mediation process, but if they want to handle it through the press, it may change. We've offered Dillian Whyte a fight for the interim championship since last October, and they've been stalling. I'm a little bit frustrated that British fans are only getting one side of the story. I've been getting insults on social media, trashing my father's reputation and insulting my family. We stand for justice. Our history is very clear, and we do the just thing via the right process. Mauricio Suleiman's statements. Well, I think, there would be a lot of people who probably listen to those statements and just think he's talking a load of bollocks, because let's face it, the sanctioning bodies make up the rules as it suits themselves as they go along for their own interest most of the time. Often they're good works that they try to do through community activities and other things. It's sort of a veneer of credibility that is immediately undermined by decisions that they make. I think the one thing we can say about sanctioning bodies is they are consistently inconsistent. And Mauricio Suleiman, he is saying that only one side of the story is coming out, but, well, what's his side of the story? We didn't really get that. He was just having a moan that some of this was being talked about. He should actually say what his side of the story is, because the narrative that we're getting from Dillian Whyte and Eddie Hearn is that the mandatory looks like it might be on the line for the Whyte and Rivas fight in July, and potentially this interim title as well. But what is the other side of the story? No point moaning about it if you're not actually going to clear it up. But it is highly unusual, these sorts of comments, because there was a veiled threat in there that if they continue acting through the media, that maybe this whole mediation process, maybe this will change, and Dillian Whyte may be sort of out on in the cold here. There was a veiled threat in all those statements from Suleiman. But it's interesting, though, because often these sanctioning bodies, and think about it yourself, and how often do you see comments coming out from the head of a sanctioning body? To hardcore boxing fans, he's a very public figure for people to vent their spleen at in terms of things with the WBC. And whenever he makes comments on his Twitter page, I've seen it before, people are instantly at him for other issues. He can be talking a photo at a gym somewhere with children, for some sort of event, and someone will start abusing him about some sort of topic. But that is part and parcel, to some extent, of being the public face of that sanctioning body. Because you think of some of the other sanctioning bodies, they are much more low profile. I guarantee some people wouldn't know who the president of the WBO or the IBF was, or what sort of statements they've been making in public recently, because, for all intents and purposes, they're way more low-key. The sanctioning bodies themselves might be just as dodgy as the WBC, but Suleiman puts himself out in public as the front man, and clearly he must like the attention, because he makes sure that he's in the photos, that he's pumping himself out in the social media coverage through the main WBC social media channels and press releases, all that sort of stuff. So he has to also expect some criticism in these sorts of scenarios. So he can't just cry wolf and saying, oh, the story's not coming out. Well, tell the story. So just to come out and sort of have a moan, I mean, what's the point? Okay, getting on to the next thing. Charles Martin is going to be fighting Daniel Martz. That's been announced. It will be on the undercard of the Jamal James and Antonio DeMarco card, July 13th. There's also another heavyweight fight on the card, which will be, somewhat competitive. Robert Helenius versus Gerald Washington. And they actually put out a press release announcing this Charles Martin and Daniel Martz fight. No quotes, though, no nothing like that. It's just sort of all straight information about the card. Not really about that fight in particular, just more the card in general. But I was just like, what the hell are they doing with Charles Martin? Why is he facing Daniel Martz, who's a flat-out journeyman? This is, a gross mismatch, and we're just getting too many of these. Daniel Martz is not very good. He's a journeyman who only beats journeymen. He's never really had any real notable wins. And he's been relatively inactive the past couple of years. I mean, back in 2017, he fought Luis Ortiz. He got knocked out then. He's had a couple of low-level fights since then against guys who have had 45 collective losses on their record. Other notable losses to Bryant Jennings and also to Joseph Parker. But he's the sort of guy that you might have, as a comeback fight after a bad loss, for example. But, what's Charles Martin doing? He went from fighting Adam Kownacki in a relatively competitive fight that somewhat rehabilitated his image because he put on a good performance. It was a tough, gritty effort. He came back in that fight, almost, stealing it late on. He had Kownacki hurt a bit in that, was it the 9th or 10th round? Ultimately, he lost the decision on the cards, but it went all 10. It was a good effort, and it was a very fun fight. But since then, he dropped down to Gregory Corbin. Okay, coming off a loss, a guy like Corbin, who was unbeaten at the time, but an unproven prospect, and I think most people thought that he would beat Gregory Corbin. But then he drops down after Corbin to Daniel Martz. I just, this should have been the point where he was taking another step back up. Someone in the top 50 or something like this. Where is Daniel Martz actually ranked at the moment? 191st. I think you would have actually, and that's on BoxRec, I think you would have, he's 50th out of the USA heavyweights. I think you would have expected better for Charles Martin at this point. I just don't understand what the strategy is. Obviously, they want to keep him, busy to some extent, but going from Kownacki down to Corbin and now further down to Martz doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And this will be one of these occasions. Charles Martin's going to wreck him with a left hand early in the fight, the first or second round. Daniel Martz will hit the canvas. He'll look to make an attempt to get up and then sort of start shaking his head. He often does that in those fights, in these sort of losses. He gets hurt and sort of, shakes his head and, doesn't beat the count. And you sort of think, I think you could have beat the count. I think Daniel Martz is, cannon fodder. That's all it is. And before I go, just wanted to touch on Adam Kownacki and Chris Arreola. They've had their press conference come face-to-face. There's some quotes here I want to get to. This fight was announced a couple of weeks ago officially. They've had the press conference now. Kownacki says, "This is an exciting moment for me. When I first fought at the Barclays Center, I fought after the main event. So this is just an amazing feeling to be headlining. Arreola has been in there with everyone, so I know he's a tough test. He's coming off 2 knockout wins, so I know I'll be ready. But I'm more ready. I've worked hard to get to this moment. This is another step towards becoming a world champion. I'm looking to put myself in line for a world title shot. I can't wait for this one. Adam Kownacki, he goes in the heavy favourite for this against a very shop-worn Chris Arreola, who I think he'll give it a go, but does he really have a chance in this? I mean, I think to some extent, most people think that this is a bit of a mismatch. It's certainly not a Charles Martin-Daniel Martz mismatch, which actually is probably a worse mismatch than Joseph Parker versus Alex Leapai. This whole thing about mismatches, we've got to call this year the year of the mismatch, because it just seems like it's out of control now. But Arreola says, Adam and I are going to put on a great fight. I'm really excited for this one. As a fan, this is the kind of fight I'd want to watch. It's going to be a fight that's talked about for years. Everybody knows this is going to be a great fight. People always have something negative to say anyway, so I'm only controlling what I can. I'm really looking forward to this fight and displaying the new tricks of the trade that I'll be implementing into this fight. It goes on here, but it's kind of mostly the same. New tricks of the trade, I think at, 37 years old and on the decline for a number of years. If he does pull out some new tricks, I'd be very surprised. I think he's going to come forward and do what he does best, throw punches, and we'll see how it goes. I think Adam Kownacki is the favourite for good reason, but yeah, what do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.